Hi, I'm Steve Clemens, and I have a question. Are evangelicals giving President Trump the votes he needs to win a second term? Let's get to the bottom line. About a third of Americans identify themselves as born again or as evangelical Christians. And among that group, almost all of them voted for Donald Trump in 2016. And the vast majority say they're going to do it again in a few weeks. In return, Trump has pushed the religious rights agenda with his culture war and socially conservative policies, the appointment of conservative judges, and support for Israel's government. But what is this huge group in American society? And how did they become such an enormous influence on America's political scene? What do evangelical Christians believe in? And what do they want? My guest today has spent his life researching and writing about American Christian fundamentalism and its global network. He is Jeff Sharlet, the executive producer of The Family, a docudrama that was released on Netflix last year, based on his own book, The Family, The Secret Fundamentalism at the Heart of American Power. Mr. Sharlet, thank you so much for joining us today. In your show and your writing, I'm amazed by the degree to which you have had a foot in the evangelical camp and a foot out, if you will, and you've been able to tell this story, and yet I think you still describe yourself as part of that world. How have you been able to navigate these currents?
I am deeply interested in that world and been reporting on it for many years, but I am not an evangelical Christian. The Netflix series and the book is about an organization called The Family, the oldest and most influential Christian conservative political movement in Washington, and in fact, actually sort of active globally as well. And they subscribe to a theological view that once you're a member, you're chosen by God for membership. And it doesn't matter what you do, doesn't matter if you want to be a member or not, you're chosen. So I became a member, and so I'm chosen. I'm a brother of the family. I'm a bad brother from their perspective, because here I am talking with you, reporting out in the world, raising questions about their theological views. But I guess I'm still a brother.
What do they want from President Trump? And I just, I'm sure you've been asked this a million times. How have they been able to square their own religious views and their aspirations with someone who has a kind of complicated past and a complicated set of behaviors, one might argue, with President Trump?
I think to understand the white evangelical embrace of Trump, you really have to understand that the movement is not monolithic. And in fact, from much of its sort of history over the last 100 years, it's sort of had two wings. It's had the populist front, and that's what you see. That's the folks who are talking about the moralists, the Bible thumpers, the pulpit pounders. And then there's also always been an elite, a self-described avant-garde, best represented by this organization called The Family, which holds the National Prayer Breakfast every year, attended by every president since Eisenhower. Their view, which has become the mainstream view for white evangelicalism, is deeply transactional. They're not so much interested in the character of the leader as that leader's willingness to implement the policies, the ideas, the laws, the theology that they believe in. And so in Donald Trump, they've gotten that. Donald Trump understood that was a deal. He was willing to make the deal, and he has paid off. He's been the most productive president for evangelical conservatives in U.S. history, more so than Ronald Reagan, more so than George W. Bush, by a distance. So when we ask, how can they embrace this, thrice married adulterer and so on, we have to remember they're religious folks, but they're also political folks. They have things they want to get done, and Trump gets them done.
Well, Jeff, I remember watching one of the prayer breakfasts. I had actually been invited and I couldn't attend, but I watched it later online. And it's when President Trump went and was talking about his ratings and then challenged Arnold Schwarzenegger over ratings. Senator Chris Coons was there, and his face just turned green. Senator Chris Coons, a Democrat from Delaware, really does believe in the power of the prayer breakfast. He's a Democrat. And so it's this foil of two images, one really devout about faith, the other that seemed hardly to care about it. Am I getting this wrong?
Yes and no. I mean, in the sense, The Family, of which Chris Coons has been a participant, it's different than the mainstream Christian right in the sense that it's always had a small number of Democrats involved. It's always been mostly conservative. Globally, it's very conservative, but there's always a few Democrats. They have a bigger picture, longer term view of their political project. So they have room for those folks. And they even have room, of course, for someone like Donald Trump, who's crass and buffoonish and no one's idea of a pious man. But there's a way in which Trump has remade the National Prayer Breakfast. He's remade the Christian right. He's remade it in his image. I don't think we can overemphasize how profound a shift Trumpism is. We almost want to think of it as a new theological movement. It's drawing not just on the Christian right, but on the conspiracy theories of QAnon, this idea that all of Trump's enemies, Democrats, are involved in an international child trafficking ring. That's gone mainstream in evangelicalism. And meanwhile, the organization of evangelicalism, the political lobbying, the power, has given a kind of worldly presence to what was once a digital fringe of QAnon. So these things have merged, and Trump's sort of most outlandish comments at the National Prayer Breakfast go from being shocking to someone like Chris Coons to being accepted and even celebrated by most of the members of the family.
But I guess part of my deep interest in this question are the contradictions that evangelicals carry with them. That if you go, you find a Twitter account of an evangelical who's active politically, it might have a guy who served in the military, says he's a child of Christ, a real patriot, be holding up with a gun, might have talk about white America. And so from someone who looks at Christianity as a religion, as a forgiving religion, as a religion of the lost or the needy, is seeing something very different in these visual images. And I'm wondering if you can give our viewers an understanding of some of what the evangelical carries and how it got so woven into a very kind of pugnacious, dark politics.
Yeah. I think here again, groups like the family and the sort of the elite wing, which were more theologically sophisticated, if you want to put it that way, are out front and have sort of shaped the ideas that the rest of the movement now subscribes to. So whereas Christianity, of course, has always emphasized, maybe not always adequately, but the poor and the weak and the suffering, the down and out, this group, the family, began back in the 1930s and from their point of view, an anti-socialist movement with what they believed was a vision from God, telling them that Christianity had been getting it wrong for nearly 2,000 years by focusing on the down and out, that those whom God cared most about were the up and out. That is, figures that were in power, that God had put in power. And it didn't really matter the virtues of that person. God was using that kind of figure. They would compare it to King David in the Bible, who most people know is the story of David and Goliath, the young boy who kills the giant. The adult David becomes a much more complicated figure, not always a good man by any stretch. It doesn't matter to them. They use this to say, this is a model for political leaders. You're chosen by God to do God's work. And here's where it gets really scary. They have long compared Christ not to a lamb, but to, and I'm quoting here because it sounds so outlandish, to say, if you want to understand the strength of Jesus, they'll say, look at Hitler, Stalin, Lenin, Mao. And you look at this horrific list of figures. It's not fascist exactly. It's not communist exactly. The common denominator for them is strength. And I think in the last 30 years.
So wait. So you're saying they admire, I mean, I hate to interrupt, but you say they're saying Mao and Lenin and Hitler with admiration.
Admiration, yes. I don't know if I'd put it respect. They're clear that these are evil men. But when they try and understand their Christ, they don't see a peaceful lamb-like figure. They see a figure of strength. They emphasize that spectrum to sort of say that the virtue that they most admire and the Jesus that has come to be at the heart of the American Christian right is strength and sort of a strong man personality that they see reflected in Donald Trump. So that, for instance, you look back at the 2016 campaign, one of the best-selling evangelical books in support of Trump was called God's Chaos Candidate by an evangelical for Trump called Lance Wallnau. And in the book, he describes Trump as a wrecking ball. He says, this is what the hour is now. And you see that across the Christian right now. books like Wild at Heart, emphasizing those verses of the New Testament that emphasize violence, or Christ says, "I come not to bring peace but the sword." That violent men shall take the kingdom of heaven by force. Now, these are metaphors, but they've become literalized in the kind of violent rhetoric that surrounds Donald Trump.
Jeff, I want to play a clip for you of the president talking about Joe Biden.
He's following the radical left agenda. Take away your guns, destroy your Second Amendment, no religion, no anything, hurt the Bible, hurt God. He's against God, he's against guns, he's against energy, our kind of energy.
He's against God, he's against guns, and he's against our kind of energy. Now, you've talked a lot about the code, the secret handshake, the signaling that goes on in this community. Is that what President Trump is doing as he depicts Joe Biden?
What's fascinating about Trump's rhetoric now, and I've been sort of reporting last fall, I spent some time traveling around the country, going to Trump rallies, talking to everyday Trump supporters, I'm always looking at what is the religious element here. And that QAnon conspiracy theory that, again, was fringe, has now moved into the mainstream, and it's become a kind of a theological justification. So Trump is, in as much as he's sort of signaling to the Christian right base, he's simultaneously talking to the QAnon believers who are looking at things in more and more stark, good and evil, final spiritual war battle terms. They call it the storm. And Trump is appealing to that. And maybe more than appealing to it. What was really fascinating, you showed us that clip. There's another clip when he was speaking to Laura Ingraham a couple of weeks ago. And he went too far even for her, talking about the dark shadows, as he put it, that secretly control Biden, these people in the streets and we don't know their names. In other words, he's not just sort of promoting the conspiracy theory, he's almost sort of entered into it, this very frightening mix of conspiracy and theology that has come to displace what is the better traditions of American evangelicalism. They are there, but they're not at the fore right now.
Look, I want to ask you, I don't want to mislead our audience either, and it's one of these things that's very hard to kind of unwind if you're not in it like you are much more closely. I know a lot of evangelicals and born-again Christians. They're really decent people. They have different views in some cases than I do, but they don't believe, a guy who owned a pizza place in D.C. had an underground basement for child trafficking, and which was one of the disproved conspiracy theories out there. But a guy went up with a gun and threatened people up there. It's just a remarkable part of the QAnon conspiracy theory. So I guess when we talk about QAnon and talking about signaling, why isn't that disqualifying in the eyes of many other evangelicals when he's chasing a fringe part, what has to be a fringe part of the evangelical community?
It's not fringe anymore. There's a recent poll that showed that altogether something like 56% of the Republican Party subscribes to some part of QAnon's theories. A full third believe that almost all of QAnon is true. And increasingly, we have Trump. Trump, of course, has endorsed QAnon. He says these are people who love our country. It's moved from the fringe to the mainstream. And I think of an evangelical pastor I know who has described the sort of frustration at talking to his peers because so many of them have embraced it. Of course, not everybody. And there's lots of folks who have kept their wits and their faith about them. But more and more, they're the fringe. They're the ones who are being pushed to the margins. We saw that back in 2016, and it's completely solidified now. People talked about the Christian right leaders who opposed Trump, and there were some people, they had their conscience wouldn't allow them to support it. They lost. They got pushed out of their organizations. Second and third tier leaders who lined themselves up with Trump are now in the driver's seat of that movement. So that's what I speak of this Trumpism as a kind of transformation, a transformational moment, and certainly a shakeup of where the power is within the Christian right.
One of the other parts of this movement, which I don't quite understand, is what seems to be a rejection of science. Just this week, there were some scientists who revealed that there may be evidence of life on one of the moons of Venus. And I sort of facetiously tweeted out there, but somewhat seriously saying, I wonder what the evangelical community might say about this or think about this. And so I guess as we struggle with the pandemic, as we struggle with COVID-19 and the importance of science saving us, how does science fit in or not fit in to the political mindset of the evangelical community?
I think about it in terms that a man named Chuck Colson explained to me. Chuck Colson, who was to Nixon perhaps as Roger Stone is to Trump. He was sort of the brains behind the dirty tricks operations, and he ended up going to prison for his role in Watergate. There he was born again through this organization, the family, and he came out to found an organization called Prison Ministry and become one of the really leading intellectuals of the Christian right. And the way Colson put it to me, he said, pick any issue you want that the Christian right cares about, whether it's creationism or abortion or LGBTQ rights, whatever it is. He says, these are all just wedges. They're not the main issue. The main issue has always been, for him and for many in the Christian right, between the authority of God and secularism. And so I think for a lot of far-right evangelicals, they don't see themselves as anti-science. They see themselves as anti-secularism. They say we can have science, but it has to be within this framework of theology. Theology has to sort of reign supreme over that. And that allows them to take these wild anti-science positions without feeling as if they've gone off the deep end. They think that they're still within a logical order of the universe.
So you've also written about the global network, and what's interesting is that some of the states that we right now see the UAE Israel deal in Bahrain and Egypt and Jordan. Some of these states pride themselves on being highly secular states that are normalizing with Israel. But I want to play a clip for you, President Trump, talking about this.
We moved the capital of Israel to Jerusalem. That's for the evangelicals. It's amazing with that. The evangelicals are more excited about that than Jewish people. It's really, right? It's incredible. But we did that. And Golan Heights, don't forget Golan Heights. We did Golan Heights.
So Jeff, what's going on there? I mean, it is interesting, and I follow Middle East politics pretty closely. But I think Donald Trump is right that there's a lot of evangelical enthusiasm for some of the moves that have been made with Israel. But it is also striking to me that those new alliances that Israel is getting are with starkly secular or mostly secular governments in the Middle East that are rejecting a kind of theological government, if you will.
I can't speak to the specifics of how those deals are coming about. What I can say is that you said what's going on there. I think it's very, very pretty straightforward in Trump's mind. It's the art of the deal. It's a quid pro quo. And that deal for him, as it long has been for American conservatives, is a deal with the American Christian right. And if the American Christian right cares about Israel because it fits into their prophetic understanding of the world, then there's any number of Republican politicians and conservative politicians who will line up to sort of service that theology. And Trump has done it more cynically and more aggressively than most. And look, I mean, if that leads to some improvement in peace, all to the best. But I don't think we should mistake that for any kind of broad-minded foreign policy. That's domestic policy played out in Middle Eastern terms.
Jeff, one of the things that I've been struggling with as I think about these issues is, I guess, the legacy of tolerance that America was about. It was about commingling people, that individual right of faith to worship as one wanted. But we had lots of different ones. You go to South Carolina, there are synagogues, there are churches, there's lots of things, and also among the founding fathers, and a kind of built-in separation of church and state. And I guess the question I have, it seems that what the evangelical movement is trying to accomplish is as you've just said, is sort of the destruction of that secularist ethic. And I want to, I'll be like Rachel Maddow, tell me where I'm wrong.
I wish I could. I wish I could. I'll say, or I can tell you where many Christian right folks would say that you're wrong, was that that's not part of the founding. That the founding, this was founded as a Christian nation. The Christian nationalism isn't something new. That this idea of separation of church and state is something new. Some go to conspiratorial ideas, saying that Thomas Jefferson never really wrote that in his letter to the Danbury Baptist. That's the document in American history where we find that phrase. Some look to Supreme Court cases in the 1950s and 60s and said it introduced an alien idea that the United States is fundamentally a Christian nation. What was fascinating and overlooked in 2016, and it looks like it's going to be overlooked again in 2020, is that Trump early on, actually in 2015, he understood that if he was going to court the Christian right, he needed to talk that talk. And he went and said, this is a Christian nation, and we have to preserve it for Christians. And there's a strong element of race mixed in with that. That he means a white Christian nation, of course. We've seen that. And so they don't see that they're overturning a tradition of tolerance. They see themselves as restoring the truth of Christian supremacy.
Jeff, in our final minute or so, I'm just interested in your insights into the Achilles heel of the movement. Is there a way that if will it split one day between Democrats and Republicans? Will it eventually shrink because it's hit a top point? Or do you think it's a juggernaut that will just continue to grow without, being able to be stopped at some point? How do you see the weak points of it and the possible fall of evangelical political movement?
So real quick, I think the bad news and the good news. The bad news is ever since 1925, when there was something called the Scopes monkey trial. This was about teaching evolution in schools. And the evolutionists were widely derided in the press, and the press declared fundamentalism dead as a force in U.S. history. Overlooking the fact, by the way, the fundamentalists won that court case. But it didn't matter. They were seen as fools. Since 1925, it's almost sort of like a drumbeat. Every 5-10 years, the press declares the Christian right, fundamentalism gone, we're past all that. 2008, when I published when I first published that book, folks asked me, why have you been talking about this now with Obama elected? Clearly, the Christian right is gone as a force in American life. So it does endure. And it endures in partly because there's sort of this entwining of a populist front and an elite front. And when one side sort of rises, the other falls, there's always a continuity. That's the bad news for those who are interested in separation of church and state. The good news is it's also a movement that is constantly breaking up into factions, has a democratic core, a small d, I don't mean Democratic Party, a small d democratic core that says, hey, I get to think for myself about what my relationship to God is. And that drives it into factions, into realignments, and to new theologies, new visions. So anybody who's counting on that, if the Republicans are not counting on this just being rock solid forever, that's not a safe bet. The fault lines are there, but it depends on those within that movement to say enough of this transaction, and now it's time to return to our faith.
Well, Jeff, Charlotte, thank you. I really appreciate these insights. I've often thought to myself, not only about the trial you mentioned, but also, we're on the verge today, if you look across the board, of scientific and technological breakthroughs, which will be extraordinary, which will make everything we achieved in the past look small. And yet, if Galileo were somehow resurrected around today, he might still be found guilty. So, we feel like we're in those are the, the tensions that are about this. So thank you so much for sharing your insights with us today.
Thank you, Steve. Good talking with you.
So what's the bottom line? Of course, it's fine to be a person of faith, and it's also everyone's human right. But America's style of faith and politics has also been built on a separation of church and state, a strong current of secularism that defines the state, but which respects an individual's faith. The big question now about the evangelical movement being so empowered in Trump's America is this: is American secularism collapsing? In my opinion, not yet. But there are warning signs. The evangelical agenda matters and should be in the mix. but it needs to coexist with other religions and atheism and other views. Evangelicals are motivated, but so too are those who see things differently. And that's the bottom line.